So go ahead and check that out. As well, one other thing, there is our upcoming events. So we have events scheduled in January, in February, and even through March. And so check out some of the events we have coming up, and we hope you guys will be able to attend some of those. Let me grab Dr. Hubbard, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Ann. I'm one of our practitioners here at the Reardon Clinic, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Sean Hubbard today. And today we're going to do this lecture a little bit different than some of the other ones in the past. We're going to make this a little bit more of an interview style lecture. So I have a series of questions that I'm going to ask Dr. Hubbard. He's going to kind of talk through. If you guys have any questions as we're going, go ahead and raise your hand. We're going to try not to get too far off track, and we'll have a definite Q&A section at the end of the lecture. But as we kind of get going, we're going to kind of morph this lecture into what you guys really want to hear about in connection with the brain. So without further ado, this is Dr. Sean Hubbard, and I'm going to let him introduce himself and tell you a little bit about his history. But the one thing I will say about Dr. Sean is we're both trained as chiropractors. He's got a lot more extensive training on the brain than I do. But when I first started working here at the Reardon Clinic, probably more so than any other practitioner in the area, I heard over and over and over again, have you met Dr. Hubbard? Have you met Dr. Hubbard? You need to meet Dr. Hubbard. You guys, think very similarly. And so it was at least a good year or two before we finally actually met in person. And, I would say we are somewhat kindred spirits when it comes to how you approach the body and the brain. So I'm really, really excited to have him here today because he's got a lot of really great information to share with you. So without further ado, Dr. Hubbard.
Well, thank you so much. So the question always comes up, how does a chiropractor get involved in the brain? And it all comes down to about 6.5 years ago, I had a patient who called me one morning and said, look, I'm sitting here in bed, the world's spinning around my head, and it seems like it's going in and out, closer and farther away from me. Just as I sit here, everything seems to get worse. So, I said, look, we need to make sure you're not having anything like a stroke happening, anything along those lines. So once all that was clear, unfortunately for this young lady, that was the best she was going to feel for the next 13 weeks of her life. So as it went through, the world started to grow big to where her bedroom seemed bigger than this lecture room right here. The floor waved in like this on her, like the ocean rolling in, and it constantly moved. She spent 13 weeks in bed in the dark except to go see doctors. And it was an exhausted list of doctors, everybody that anybody could come up with to go see what's following and what's figuring out your problem. Why are you still sick? What's going on? Unfortunately, when it came down to the specialist of all specialists to see in our Wichita area, they said, look, ma'am, we can tell you are suffering greatly. We have no idea why. We have no idea what's going on. And so the best advice I have for you is go home and pray that this disappears the same way it showed up. Well, that didn't sit so hot with her family and her, even though it was the honest truth, right? And so they start looking for other resources out of town. Where can I go? What can I do? And they came across a doctor in Atlanta, Georgia, that specialized in balance disorders in the brain. This doctor said, sure, we'll take your case. We'd be happy to see you after reviewing all the case notes. The doctor said, but it's about 6 months before I can see you. So you're going to have to hang in there during that period of time. She literally, at this point, was bedridden, losing muscle strength and all these kind of deals, right? And things were getting worse. So happily, like the Friday after Thanksgiving, they get a call from this clinic. They said, hey, look, we've got an opening on the 29th. Can you be down here? And they're like, of December? Sure, we can be there in a month, not a problem. They know we kind of meant Monday. And if you can be down in Atlanta on Monday, we'll be able to see you. And the other caveat is ABC Nightline cameras are going to be there. And so if you'll let them into your life for that period of time, we can see you 5 months earlier than we planned on. All right, so away she goes. They have to drive because she can't get in an airplane. The world's spinning constantly, so the idea of flight was crazy. The drive was nuts enough, right? So 1,000 miles down to Atlanta, the car goes. Within the first week of being there, the first day of being there, they took her from being basically carried into the office to standing on her own power. By day 2, she was walking again. By day 3, actually after their treatment, as she was going back to the hotel that evening, it started to rain, and she took off running towards the hotel. So the reality is, if it sounds like I know a whole lot about this story, it's because it's my wife. Okay? So I got to live with this with her the entire step of the way, completely helpless, trying to figure out what's going on. So I know many of you have battled other healthcare conditions at times, and you feel like there aren't answers. And sometimes there aren't answers, and sometimes there are. But even when you got these wonderful titles in front of your name, sometimes there aren't answers. Okay? So we get down there, and as that progresses through there, this doctor stopped me in the hall. And in the way that only a Canadian soldier can tell you, which is completely inappropriate to tell in front of any audience, he said, I just want you to know you are wasting your resources, your time, and you're not serving your community in the way you should. There's no reason someone should have to drive 1,000 miles to get something like this fixed. So get on the ball, and that's where the training in this world of functional neurology and the brain started. That was a reaction into this world because Dr. Carrick I had known from 10 years earlier in lectures and learning about brain and childhood development disorders and things along those lines. But I wasn't using any of the information that he gave me. So there it comes. And we start into a world of brain injury and how to treat brain injuries, how to diagnose brain injuries, how to understand brain injuries. Because it's a big underdiagnosed thing, and you see it on the news every time. You can't turn on the TV without concussion coming up, something along those lines. What we found through our coursework in working with brain injuries is a lot of the problems that we suffer with as Americans going forward as we age are very similar to what people suffer with a concussion. The difference is a concussion has a moment in time that the injury happened instead of years of degeneration that happen. So you'll see someone after getting a blow to the head. They'll end up with posturing. They'll end up with tremors. They'll end up with memory loss. They'll end up with balance disorders. And these things all just kind of come together to say, we're able to help these early stage problems. Why can't we do something to help what's happening in America? And it's an epidemic of neurodegeneration. So that's what I wanted to come talk to you about today. That's how I got involved in it. And that's how, my life got turned upside down from being a typical practicing chiropractor, seeing neck pain, back pain, achy stuff all day long, to working just with brain disorders and problems with the nervous system that don't have a lot of times full-on diagnoses. You don't have a tumor, yay. You don't have an infection, yay. But you're still suffering. Things just aren't going right in your life for it. Or, boy, I feel like I'm losing my memory a little bit. Well, you don't have Alzheimer's, you don't have Parkinson's, you don't have dementia. Are you trending that way? Maybe. But you don't have it yet. So we can't do anything until you do have it. That doesn't sit super well in my mind, because if we know someone's about to have this thing, and there's interventions that we can have and things that we can do in our normal daily lives that will prevent that further degeneration, why wouldn't we do it? And those are the things that we've been able to find in ways that we've been able to help people. Lots of them are daily habits that we have. Others are just things that we can do specifically for you and your own condition.
I feel like we see a lot of co-learners that have the experience that your wife had where they know something is wrong. They know they don't feel right, yet everybody they go to thinks that they are crazy because you can't pinpoint something on an MRI. You can't pinpoint something on, the tangible imaging or the tangible blood tests that we do. And so they're just told that, take an antidepressant and, deal with it. And so kind of in that vein, can you maybe take a few steps back and describe kind of how the brain works? How does it develop? How is it that some of the stuff we can't see on MRIs? We have, the structure of the brain, but explain what the difference is between structural abnormalities and then functionally what goes wrong, because the realm you deal with is more functional. It's not stuff you can see on imaging. So maybe describe a little bit about that.
The best description I have, since we're all in Kansas and we've driven past these fields of wheat, right? We have 100 billion neurons within our head. okay, which is the equivalent of, I believe, 64,000 acres of wheat if every stalk equaled a neuron. Okay? So the reality is someone could go out into that 64,000 acres of wheat, pull one stalk of wheat out of each of those 64,000 acres, and they'd have 64,000 stalks of wheat. The farmer, no one would know. You couldn't tell. You couldn't look out there and go, wow, there's a big gaping hole in my field, right? Because they've taken just a little bit. Now, if that same thief went out and took 64,000 stalks out of 1 acre, there'd be a great gaping hole. Okay? So what we see on imaging oftentimes are those great gaping holes. What we deal with in our office a lot of times isn't so much 1 out of all 64,000, but let's say 32,000 were removed out of 1 acre, but not contiguous, right? So they're not stuck together. So it's just here and there, and that farmer goes, I'm getting 50 bushels of wheat everywhere else, and I got 40 here. What happened? Right? And so we look for things, what is going on in your life? How are you functional? What is happening that can give us clues to do that, right? And so this is where we get to do a first little test that I get to do in the audience. I promise not to grade you, okay? You get to grade yourself, though. All right, so if you can't do this, don't, right? But if you can all make a big L with your hand, right? And if
you're not losers.
Not losers. You're all winners. You're here. You're doing something about yourself. And you can go like this, and then that. And then I want you to do it 10 times as fast as you can. All right? So since God gave us 2, right, we're going to do the other side as well. So do the same thing with the other. Okay, so I can see it from here. Many of you have differences from side to side. Okay, some of you probably felt that difference. There is nothing diagnostic about what we just did. Okay, however, there is a functional abnormality from side to side because we really don't have a difference in speed, reaction time from side to side built into us, right? But sometimes it does. The other thing we talk about always, and I'm not going to probably have you guys do this, okay, just because it's not the safest thing to do, but one of our biggest early signs that we might be predisposed to dementia, Alzheimer's, something along those lines, is our ability to balance in space. All right, and so there's one little test where we just go like this. Stand on 1 foot, okay? If you can't do it for 30 seconds, there's a probability something's going on. The probability of knowing what that is about 0, right? It's a functional problem because a normal human adult, barring injury, should be able to stand up on their foot for greater than 30 seconds. And this has been linked oftentimes to you've got a probability of going down one of these roads of dementia, Alzheimer's, or Parkinson's. So we'll look at that. And of course, for me, then we check one side to the other, right? Is there something going on there? Right? The whole dementia thing is, can you stand on 1 foot? So those are some of the things that we look at. What is functionally going on with you that made you show up in my clinic, right? Most people don't just come in without any problems. You're not seeking out doctor's advice when everything's going your way, right? But we end up with, I think I'm on average the 12th practitioner someone sees for their healthcare problems, okay? The only reason you get to 12 is 1 through 11 didn't solve it, right? So that's the things we're looking for. How do you change functionally from side to side? From how do you stand up in the world, right? So if standing up on 1 foot is a big key, the inability to stand on both is a huge key. The inability to take a step forward is a huge key. Why does the 1 foot matter? Because as we walk, we spend 75% of our time on 1 foot. So the reality is walking is nothing but a series of controlled falls that our brain is able to deal with. So as we take a step forward, you're falling forward, but you're smart enough to get the other foot out there. If I get too close to this, I might be not so smart and I'll fall off and have to go see Dr. Ann for something that's hurting, right? Does that answer that?
Yeah, that does. Okay. So can you maybe explain, without getting too deep into, pathways, explain how is it that those tests are predictive of an issue? Like functionally, what is happening, in the brain in certain specific areas that is causing some of those functional weaknesses? Yeah,
so some of that goes back to, I don't want to get terribly into the developmental stages of life, right? But it goes back to development even. As we're born as a baby in the United States or anywhere in the world, we're the only mammal that really isn't ready to be outside of mom's womb. We're very dependent on them for the first 12 to 24 months. But even the first 0 to 12 months
18 years.
Well, you can ask my parents that are here. I don't know if it ever stops. But you get into the spot where the first 12 months of life, almost everything that baby is doing is based on how do I walk? How can I get on my inefficient mode of transportation, which is 2 legs, and go? All right? Because our eyes are in the front of our head, we need to be able to ambulate. So it even starts when that little kid just starts looking around the room, and you see these eyes go boom, 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 That starts developing muscles of the neck, starts developing coordination of head and eye movements, so a person can deal with movement that happens in space. Okay? And if I'm getting too deep, you got to stop me. Okay? So, and then it goes from I'm moving my eyes to I'm moving my head to I'm rolling over from side to side to I'm bringing my head up. And this develops a lot of our systems that let our brain know where we are in space, which is its single biggest job. Where am I in my environment? Am I too darn close to this edge, or am I a safe spot away from it? That's really what it's doing up here almost all the time. It gets that information from 3 systems: our inner ear, our eyes, and our muscles and joints, especially these muscles of our core. Okay? And so through all of that, it's a giant orchestra, right? And we've all been to a middle school band performance or orchestra performance or something along those lines, right? And you kind of got to imagine the song that's being played because the conductor told you what it was. All right? And then some of us have been either heard on the radio or we've been to the symphony where everything's perfect and it's just this grand aura of music coming at you. What's the difference between those? It's practice and perfection and function. Okay, and so all through our years we're developing how to do this. And it even goes back to our old ancient prophecy of what stands on 4 legs in the morning stands on 2 in the afternoon and then 3 or 4 again in the evening, and that's humankind going from crawling to standing and walking to using assisted devices as we start to do this. So lots of these postures that happen in people's lives really are a signal that this brain isn't getting that information from one of those 3 systems correctly. All right? And when that happens, the brain does things to make sure you can stand up straight. And it doesn't care if it hurts. It doesn't care if it slows you down. All it really cares about is, can I stand? So that
yeah, no, and kind of along those lines, as a baby develops, maybe talk a little bit about the connections that are being made, the neuroplasticity, as far as how functionally do we make those connections when we're young, and then as we age, apart from concussion, which you mentioned, right, what are some of the other things that we're doing that is causing degeneration in the brain? And if we do have degeneration, is it too late? Is there something you can do about it?
All right. So the wonderful thing, this world of, it's called neuroplasticity, which is really why my practice even exists. Without it, I'd be a pointless fool making people do funny things like this, right? But because of it, we do know that our brain can make new connections. So far in the world of science, we can't make new neurons, we don't think.
Which are the brain cells.
Yeah, the little brain cells that are up there. So those 100 billion you have, that's what you have. So as your lifestyle chops some of those off, then they're not coming back because you quit some things, right? But those cells can make interconnections with other cells to perform the same task. And that's kind of neuroplasticity. It just means the brain can change. This is a relatively new concept in science, right? From 1990 to the year 2000, we learned more about the brain than all of history combined. All right? And we're learning more about it every single day. But from 1990 to the year 2000, this idea of neuroplasticity started to happen. It started to make its way into progressive practitioners' minds in probably 2005 to 2010. It's now an accepted reality that neuroplasticity is there. But prior to this last 25 years, your brain's your brain. You have what you have. If it dies off, it's gone. And there's nothing we can do about it. Happily, for all of us, we find out that that is true. So some of the things that we're doing in our world today that are prolonging or making this neurodegeneration stuff prevalent, one, as a total number, we're living longer. Okay, so we're having enough time for some of these things to happen, right? But that's not the answer, because people throughout time have lived just as long. They just haven't lived as long in big groups. Okay, and so a lot of the life expectancy things, the numbers were skewed greatly by the number of people that died between 0 and 3 days. So if you have 100 people dying from 0 to 3 days and one person dying at 90, your life expectancy is somewhere around 20. Okay, but not so much the case. So that's happening, all right? The other thing is, as a society, we're not moving. We sit. We sit a lot. The average American, it's between work, school, or home, driving, and recreation, are on their butt somewhere around 16 hours a day. And it's become an epidemic of things, right? Because this brain, just like for the baby, as they're doing all of these things that are happening, as they start to crawl, as they start to move, that movement is developing our brain. We use this wonderful thing for empathy, for thought, for understanding, and for thinking. But neuroscience really thinks it all sprouts out from movement. And we're seeing more and more of that happen each day. And we're even seeing it in some younger there's a place called Naperville, Illinois, that has an incredible PE section of their school system. And that grew out of a PE teacher desperately trying to save his job. Okay? He said, if I look across at physical education, basically we have 5 to 7 kids of the 30 participating. We have 25 to 23 kids standing around watching. And somehow we make a grade out of that. So he came out with this proposal that we're going to base it on the time it takes you to travel a mile. Okay? And then you do that in your first week of school, and you do it at 15 weeks at 30, and then on each little semester break. All right? So what they found was some parents didn't like it. Like, my kid's not athletic, and they're like, we're not comparing his or her scores to our top athletes. We're going, it took you 15 minutes to make it a mile. Today it's taking you 13. That's worth an A in this course. Okay? So they found what they thought would be true. Physical abilities of kids grew in the school system. All right? Obesity rates dropped, strength and conditioning things rose, and all these types of deals went. But there's a lot of pushback about this mile. And so the PE instructor said, well, we're going to do it this way. We're going to base your grade around the amount of time you spend in PE class with your heart and target heart rate areas. And so he said, school system, buy a whole bunch of heart rate monitors for me. And so the kids, they wore these, right? And so this kept people from 25 standing around and 5 participating to they had to make activities for everybody at all times. All right, and once that happened, even more obesity rates dropped, physical fitness rose. But what they found was in this little pocket of Naperville, Illinois, standardized scores in math, science, and technology grew. To no longer way lower as the world, but into the top of the world stage, not just the United States stage. Well, Naperville's kind of a rich suburb of Chicago area. And so they said, this is just, you got smart mom and dad, so you're going to have smart kids happening. So they said, well, we'll look at that. And we looked at it over other per capita income things. Guess what? Their scores were greatly better than all of these other kids. So what they found is movement itself was key in making this brain thing. And it's completely revamped their school system to where kids that struggle in a subject, that subject will be 1 hour after PE. So you have math at 10, you struggle with math, you're going to have PE at 9 o'clock. And you get this whole movement happening, and the brain gets full of blood, it gets full of oxygen, and away it goes. So this is a huge part of what's happening in our world. On top of that, the way we eat, standard American diet is pretty sad, right? Even if you use little acronyms for it. This is causing inflammation globally in the body, and the brain doesn't respond so well to it either. And those are kind of...
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to, I have an 18-month-old son, and it's pretty amazing when you watch the development of a child, especially from this perspective. And, for him, he started walking, and he's just recently figured out how to walk up and down stairs. He's got more complex movement patterns. He started to kind of run, in the way that an 18-month-old runs. And it's amazing because literally within the past week, it's a very short period of time, he started speaking. Language has just popped up, and it's with the way that the brain organizes, it makes sense that once we start to become more comfortable with our movements, then the brain is going to connect into higher cognitive areas, and it's amazing. And anybody who's had a child has experienced this, that all of a sudden one day they just do something or they just say something, and it seems like it's out of nowhere, but the way that the complexity of the brain is such that, there's a very specific order and pattern that this all happens. And, what's interesting is I work with a lot of kids who are on the autism spectrum, and even kids who aren't fully autistic, kids who are, maybe have difficulties focusing, or they've been given an ADD diagnosis. You can look at their posture. You can look at their movement. They have a hunched forward posture. Their movement, they tend to either be really duck-footed. They tend to be weak muscularly. And so you can see physical muscular associations with some of these, what are typically just referred to as brain-based disorders, but it all has a root in our movement. And so, which is what's fascinating. So maybe Dr. Hubbard, you can talk maybe a little bit more about some of the specific things you do with people that, because if anybody has seen a functional neurologist or seen Dr. Sean, it seems like some of the stuff he does is crazy. Like we had a recent unfortunate experience where our 6-year-old got a concussion, and Dr. Hubbard was one of the first people we took him to, and, took him through this whole series of exercises. And, we had, our son had actually been cleared by the doctor. They said he was fine. Keep him out of school a few days. He's fine. We even started to question, does he need to stay home? He was acting 100% fine. But when Dr. Hubbard started doing some movement and some cognitive exercises with him, within 5 minutes, he said, "Mommy, I want to go to sleep. I'm really, really tired." So his brain was inflamed, and it was fatiguing to a level, that wasn't necessarily perceivable, just, observing him. But when he started to challenge his brain in certain ways, that was more than he could handle. And so maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Well, it all comes back to those 3 systems that we talked about again: your eyes, your inner ears, and your muscles and joints. All right, so a lot of what we do in our office is based around your ability to stand up in space, in challenging each one of those. Can you stand, first and foremost, just with your feet apart, stand shoulder width apart? And so then that's your eyes, your inner ear, and your muscles and joints are giving your brain as much information as it possibly can. Then we start robbing those senses. We'll have you stand with your eyes closed. All right, so some people will do this, and then all of a sudden it'll be movements like that, just because they're completely dependent upon their eyes to be able to tell their brain where they're at in space. The inner ear doesn't work worth a squat, right? Because that's where, once you close your eyes, you're dependent upon these muscles and joints telling your brain where you're at. So when I say about your muscles and joints, it's a big giant doctor word called proprioception, and that's the last time I'm going to say it, okay? Because I don't think that it serves most of us.
My patients know that word.
Yeah, well, mine don't. You're smarter than I am, I guess. No. Or your patients are smarter than mine. Maybe no.
That's true.
All right, but what proprioception is, right, is most of us can take our hand, we can close our eyes, someone can move your hand around, you can look over there, and you're going to have a pretty darn good idea of where your hand's at. All right? When that proprioception or that muscle and joint system breaks down, you don't. All right? So we do some tests in our office where you go like this, boom, 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 right, and close your eyes and keep doing it, right? You should be able to do that, right? For some people, that looks crazy hard. For others, it's like this when they're here. Okay? It's funny up here, but when it's you doing it, it's not so comical, right? But these people, their brain does not know where they are in space. And when your brain doesn't know where it's at in space, it's spending all of its energy it possibly has to know where it is and make all the compensations it can. And so some of these higher level functioning things we have with our brain, like thinking, empathy, feeling sorry for someone, feeling emotional with someone, that type of thing, it doesn't have time for that. Because it goes back to our basic survival things. You don't need to be able to solve complex physics to avoid a tiger chasing you. Okay? But you do need to be able to stand up and run. All right? And so when those systems are very broken, you move way more to this world of survival because we're going to move. And if you're going to take a step forward, you need to know where that left leg's going. If you don't know where it's going and it does this type of stuff to get there, right? And we've all seen, pick your feet up. You're moving so slow. You know what? The reality is that person does not have information from their feet to their brain that says, I can pick it up. So those kind of things happen. So we do lots of, if it's a proprioceptive problem, there might be some musculoskeletal work that's going to make your brain more aware of your legs and your torso. If it's an inner ear thing, there might be what we call vestibular rehabilitation, another big giant word for brain knowing where it's at. Okay? And other times it's the eyes. In order to move freely through the world, you've got to be able to look at something and keep your eyes on it. Right? And so it goes back to kids as we're talking about it. And, classically, every one of us have seen a kid in the store throwing an absolute fit. You're like, oh, can I go to another lane? And then, you get the parent that grabs them by the shoulder and is like, look at me when I'm talking to you. Okay? And this kid's like, children aren't that defiant. Okay? That child doesn't have the circuitry to fixate on what they're being told to do. Okay? Because they know by that point that there is consequences happening for the most part. I mean, we all know some that get to live life without consequences, but, as a whole, most will know that. So they don't get that defiant. Well, guess what? We see the same thing in our patients as his brain starts degenerating. Hey, look here. I said, look here. I am. Okay? But those movements of your eyes happen so fast, they're not conscious. And so you're like, hey, I see it. It's there. I'm looking at it. Right? But you're really not. And this is a lot of energy wasted throughout your day. And then, the world moves, so you got to be able to follow it. So we look a lot at eye movements. And we use a lot with our eyes because they are direct outpouchings of the brain, and they point to very specific areas of the brain. So if we notice that you have a problem in going, look at this, look at this, look at this, this, right? So your eyes have trouble getting from space to space, it speaks to a spot in the brain. If you have trouble following a thing, it talks about a spot in the space. If you have problems keeping your eyes on it, it talks to different areas. So what we have found in the work that we do is, let's say someone has trouble just following something with their eyes. Having them follow something with their eyes over and over and over again, all it does is reinforce the fact that they can't follow something with their eyes. Brain rehab is completely different than any musculoskeletal rehab there is. And that most of us have been taught, hey, if we can do 10, doing that 11th or 12th is going to be that much better. And that's true when you're rehabbing a muscle. When it comes to the brain, especially a sick brain, you do a bit of exercise for it, and then you stop and you let it recover. And then you do a bit more, and you stop and you let it recover. And you do a bit more, and you stop and you let it recover. The nice thing with the brain that's different than muscle is the brain changes like this. Okay? As a matter of fact, with what we say today, if you remember anything I had to say, you have a change in your brain, okay, in a short 1-hour window of your life. So it changes all the time very, very quickly. And so we can make dramatic changes in people very, very quickly as well because of that. Is that answering?
No, that's great.
I always ask you that.
No, that's great. And you've mentioned a number of things as far as, to kind of understand, because, again, we are our best doctors and we know our bodies the best. Yes. And so we can feel when things don't feel quite right. And so you've mentioned a number of things to watch out for as far as posture. If you feel your posture getting worse, if you feel, some of those executive functions getting, harder to focus, harder to concentrate, harder to feel emotion. You've mentioned, eye movements. You've mentioned physical movement. Is there anything else, any other signs that people can look out for that maybe speak to early degeneration in certain pathways of the brain that, that is something that if you catch it early enough, maybe working with somebody like you, they could start to reverse?
Yeah, one of the earliest signs of neurodegeneration is constipation. Okay? And that hits home with a lot of people. Why? Because, it can be a diet issue and have nothing to do with your brain. Keep that in mind, right? You're just eating terrible food, your body doesn't digest and doesn't push through, and you don't have enough fiber in through there. But what we do know from some of these disease processes, like Parkinson's per se, the tremor shows up, which is what typically drives people to their doctor when 80% of that area is degenerated. Okay? Constipation shows up very early, like 20 years earlier. Okay. The other thing is stiffness in shoulders is another big one. And changes in smell. Okay. The thing with changes in smell, none of us know that it's happening. Okay. No one comes in unless they absolutely can't smell anything, going, Doc, I can't smell anything. Right? But things you can see in a spouse, a loved one, or someone along those lines are changes in foods they want to eat. All right, because the biggest part that we typically will see is food doesn't taste as good. Or the other side of it is, in some of our retirement communities, they way over-season things or they don't even bother seasoning them. Okay? Because when this whole nose thing isn't working, food, it just becomes fiber. And it becomes chewing and it becomes, there's very specific tests we can do that, we'll say, hey, you're not smelling so great, all right? But we have people all the time. You bring them up strong, pungent smells like coffee. They're like, yeah, I smell a rose, and they're just telling you a word because they know you're asking them what they smell. And they're doing nothing but guess. They don't smell that, or they smell something, but they don't know what it is. Those are some of the earliest signs of it and things that you can look for. Slowing down of movement is another one. Outside of injury, all of a sudden, husband or wife sprains their hip, and they're moving slower for the next 4 to 6 months. It's not probably the brain. It's highly likely the injury they suffered. Right? So all of those things come into play. And same thing with the shoulder. I say shoulder stiffness is a big early sign of some of these neurodegenerative things. But if someone trips off something, reaches out and grabs something, tears all these muscles within their arm, that is what it was. It's not the brain, right? And so some things get misconstrued a little bit sometimes as we're hyper-focused on this. The reality is once you're past 50, 2/3 of people worry about memory loss. 1 in somewhere around 25 worry about cancer. Okay? So this is constantly in our mind. I've had patients come in going, I can't seem to remember names of people anymore. And say, okay, well, give me an example of that. Well, 4 years ago, I met Jim. And then I didn't see him again for 4 years. And when I saw him, I couldn't remember what his name was. Well, could you do that ever in your life? Could you meet someone once in a brief conversation and remember the name 4 years later? Maybe you could. Okay? The majority of people can't. Right? But because you get into that age bracket where you start hyper-focusing on memory loss, anytime it comes up, you go, oh no, here it comes. And it's really not the truth. Sometimes it is the truth. Like I met Jim. He's been my dad my whole life. And I walked in and I said, hi, who are you? Right? Big different story. Okay? Something that you know and that type of deal. So.
What point would you say it is a concern for memory? Because I have had a number of patients that wonder, when should this be? When should you be concerned about memory loss?
Well, if you're concerned enough to talk to your doctor about it, there's probably a concern. Okay, how many of us have had a little achy pain or something along? I guess it comes back to the study that I read a long time ago, and it said 50% of people that are in daily pain after the age of 50, less than 50% of people have even consulted their doctor about the fact that they're in daily pain. Okay? So this is where we're at as human beings. We don't typically talk to our doctor or loved ones about these problems when they're not prevalent and when they're not in my way, right? But does that make some sense, right? So that's the thing, right? If you feel like you're talking to someone or you need to talk to someone about it, there's probably more of an issue there, okay? The thing is sometimes there's dementia, sometimes there's early cognitive decline, sometimes there's just some natural cognitive decline, all right? That unfortunately is a reward for being on the planet long enough. We do have some neurodegeneration. The brain doesn't do as well at 85 as it did at 17. Well, maybe at 17, right? Especially for us boys. It's about 25 before it works right. But, you know, and this is just how our body heals, how our body deals with degeneration and those types of deals.
Yeah. So what about the people that maybe aren't necessarily relating with some of the things you're saying? They feel like they have a pretty healthy brain. What can they do to either improve performance, because you know most people could still improve either focus, attention, or to help prevent degeneration as they age?
Well, one of the big things, family history is a big deal, right? You know, I'll find people will look, you know, mom had this, grandpa had this, grandma had this, I'm concerned about having it. That's reasonable concerns to have, and you want to do everything you can to prevent it going forward, right? So some of the things that you can do in your normal daily life comes back to what I said are our problems. We sit too much, so move more, okay? And I think one thing that gets lost on people a lot of times is they'll hear from, you know, a talk like this, or they'll hear from a doctor, you need to get 30 minutes of exercise in a day to have any possibility of not having these problems, or whatever it is. But for lots, that 30 minutes a day is a daunting task. When you're not doing anything for years, even going out and walking for 30 minutes, guess what? It's going to hurt the next day. And people don't like pain, obviously, right? And so it takes a lot to get over that initial pain cycle. But if you do something more than you're doing the day before, you're better off. Right? So what I'll tell patients, because we end up seeing a lot of patients that basically their life has become in bed and at doctor's offices, right? And starting an initial movement plan with them. You know, I had a patient a couple of years ago, their initial exercises were, here's what I want you to do at home. 4 times a day, I want you to sit up for 2 minutes. Right? These muscles of their core had degenerated so much from being in bed that you got to be able to sit up before you can stand. You got to be able to stand before you can walk. You got to be able to walk before you run. Right? But so we get to that, or we'll say, okay, so here's what I want you to do. I want you to take your iPhone. I want you to take your stopwatch, your Fitbit, whatever we've got in our eye. I want you to set it for 3.5 minutes. Get on your porch, hit go, walk until it beeps. When it beeps, you turn around and you walk back. Anybody feels that they can walk for 3.5 minutes. They don't realize that's 7 most of the time. Okay? But if you can get in that habit of doing that every day, now we add a minute to it, and now you're up to 9. When you get to this magical 15-minute thing, guess what? You are now doing 80% of what we want to happen with 30 minutes. So we can get you to 15 minutes, we're moving in that direction. And then the next plan, depending on what's going on with your life, is to go, now we can do 15 minutes once a day. Let's try and work on doing 15 minutes twice a day. Hey, now you've got 30, and you're getting 100%, if not even greater benefit than doing one 30-minute session of working out. So, of course, we have patients that are constantly fit, physically fit, moving around. They're still having these problems. Diet's a big deal. You know, are you eating foods that you don't feel good after? You know, I eat and I didn't overeat, but I just don't feel good. Or it's, you know, I need the Nexium, or I need a Tums, that type of deal. These are all triggers that your body is responding to that with inflammation. All right? Inflammation's one of our biggest healthcare problems that we have, and you've been around here in the Riordan Clinic, I'm sure you've heard the word before. All right? But we want to be eating foods that are less inflammatory. There's no overwhelming constant diet. Some of the big things are sugar and red meat, okay, seem to be very inflammatory in most of us. It's not for everybody, okay? So you want to make sure you're not eating foods you don't feel well with. If you want to get more involved in it than that, there's testing to find out things that your immune system doesn't like, and you can go do that, and then you eliminate those foods. And now you're eliminating inflammation in your body. Oftentimes when we can do that, a person feels better, they're able to move more, and their brain feels better, and they can think clearer. A lot of brain fog is left out there. Because these crazy things that there's a giant connection between your gut and your brain. And depending on which bias you have, and mine is my brain to my gut, others are gut to the brain, right? But they are interconnected. If you have problems in the gut, there's often problems in the brain. If you have problems in the brain, there's often problems in the gut. So that's another place to look at doing it. The other thing is finding new activities. Spending time with people are huge, huge, huge benefits to us. We want to, as humans, we're meant to be in groups. We want to be around people. We want to have social interactions. So a lot of times when you start having some of these problems, you start to isolate yourself. And because, you don't want Mary to notice you're not as sharp as you were. Well, you know what? Go hang out with Mary, okay? Go hang out and have fun in groups. Do these hobbies you once did. For me, my hobbies as a youth was skateboarding. Probably not my best choice of things to do today, right? But maybe it'd be fun. So is that?
Yeah, and one comment I would just add to that is with exercise, especially people who are regularly exercising, a lot of the newer research is pointing to, it is important to exercise, but really movement more so than exercise. And movement entails consistent movement throughout the day, because I know a lot of people that will go to the gym in the morning. They go regularly every morning. They exercise for 30 minutes to an hour. Then they go to their job and they sit all day long. And so, you almost negate some of the benefits of, that the movement you did in the morning if you don't kind of follow that up with, and it doesn't even have to be anything complex, but, set your timer on your phone and every hour get up and walk for 3 minutes, make yourself walk and go get a drink of water, or, it's just kind of consistent movement throughout the day. And, and what's great too about what, Dr. Sean was saying is that, with the research and exercise, it doesn't have to be a big chunk of exercise per day to get the benefits of exercise. If you get 30 minutes total per day, you're going to get the same benefits as the person who does 30 minutes at one time. And so, but that 30 minutes per day could be 10 minutes walking here, 10 minutes walking there, could be parking far out at the grocery store and making yourself walk in. All those little simple strategies to kind of get your body moving, I think can be really beneficial. Yes. So, and then one other thing too, because you kind of touched on this a little bit, you said that people kind of end up in this fight or flight sort of, response, which is essentially stress. Right. So what sort of impact does stress have on the brain? And, long term, sure. What does that look like?
It's got a huge impact. One, stress is inflammation. Stress is huge amounts of cortisol in your system, which makes your body store fats in a way that it shouldn't. So there's a giant problem in there. On top of that, stress keeps you from digesting. All right. Once again, back to our tiger thing. You don't need to digest your meal to run from a tiger on the Serengeti, right? Most of us aren't living a life afraid that a tiger is going to jump out at us, okay? However, we've got a lot of chronic stress in our lives that are still, when it comes to how our body operates, it operates as if we've got a constant tiger jumping out at us all day long. Right? So you have people, every time I eat, I got indigestion, I can't eat, no matter what I do, I don't lose weight, these types of deals that happen. It is chronic stress. On top of that, inflammation in the brain, it doesn't work as well. Back to, once again, you're under chronic stress, you can't think as well, okay? And unfortunately for lots of us, a lot of our stress comes from our job where we need to perform better, right? So there's a whole movement in life to move away from stress. The whole idea of the siesta, of I work in the morning, I have lunch, and I take a nap, and then I go back, that type of stuff. It probably makes a lot of sense. But our lifestyles aren't set up around it, so we've got to find other things to do, right? So there's meditation, there is prayer, there is, once again, exercise is a huge proponent of, knocking down the stress response. Sometimes there's things we've got to do to make your brain operate in a better way that moves you from that fight or flight mode at all times.
Yeah, and the only other comment I'll make to that is when you're in fight or flight and when you're in stress, your brain is thinking about survival. So you're in some of the more primitive parts of your brain. So some of the other the parts of your brain that help you think, that help you focus, help you concentrate, help you have emotion are not going to be functioning as well in that fight or flight state. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that, and again, in the literature, all these things that Dr. Sean mentioned as far as exercise and meditation, relaxation, all of those have also been shown to have a benefit on the brain as well as stress.
Absolutely.
So, well, I wanted to leave some time. We have about 5 minutes for questions. And so if anybody has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand and we can get those answered.
Yes.
Yes.
I have a comment. Thank you, Dr. Ann, for introducing me to Dr. Hubbard. And thank you, Dr. Hubbard. You're the only doctor that understood that I wasn't dizzy. I didn't have vertigo. I just didn't know where I was in space. Mm-hmm. And you nailed it. You even said those words. And you helped me tremendously. Thank you.
Well, it's always humbling to be a part of it.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Yes.
I'm just wondering if there really is any correlation between dementia and blood type.
So the question was, is there any correlation between dementia and blood type?
Not that I am aware of, but that doesn't mean no. Does that?
There is one connection nutritionally between your blood type and sensitivity to something called lectins. If you look in our November Health Hunter, there was an article about lectins. Also, the book, The Plant Paradox by Dr. Stephen Gundry is an excellent book talking about that. And it's an indirect connection because, your blood type can impact your sensitivity to lectins. And the more sensitive you are to lectins, the more inflammation you have. And, of course, the more inflammation you have, depending on where your body, is sensitive, could cause brain-based symptoms.
Yes.
Do you think, I worked specifically with Alzheimer's and dementia patients for several years, and I felt like just in my years of doing that, patients were getting younger and younger. So do you think the prevalence of that is the sedentary lifestyle and the diet?
So the question is in working with patients with Alzheimer's and dementia, it seems that the prevalence of these conditions occurring is in people that are younger and younger.
Yeah, there's a huge component to diet. There's a huge component to lifestyle. There's also, we're better able to diagnose and we have some treatments. So when those things come into play, then the diagnosis seems to swing to younger and younger. Does that make some sense what I'm talking about? The example I always use is Viagra. This wasn't a problem until the commercials started happening, right? Of course, it was always a problem, but then we had a treatment. So now, lots of people have it, right? The little blue pill. So the same type of thing is there's better diagnosis today. And so some early stages of it, people are going to their doctor and seeking help for it.
One other comment I will make with that, this is becoming more and more well known, but they are calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes because of its connection with insulin resistance and insulin resistance in the brain. And so not that, there's a direct correlation with this getting younger, but when you look at the diet and, the amount of not only sugar, but also simple carbohydrates, grains that we're getting in our diet, the prevalence of obesity, the prevalence of diabetes, you can kind of start to see a correlation there that perhaps blood sugar, might have some connection.
And in that, right, is it's being termed type 3 diabetes. That doesn't mean you need type 2 in order to have it. Okay? This is the world of pre-diabetes and constantly having inflammation because of your blood sugar problems, right? And right now, it's somewhere around 80% of people that are pre-diabetic don't even know that they have it, right? And the unfortunate thing is most of the time is even if you have it, it's a passing comment. Nothing is done about it, right? But that comes back to diet and exercise are a huge thing. But yeah, we've got constant chronic inflammation, and it's making it happen at a younger age.
Yeah, let's say you had a stroke. Now you're not able to move around as well as before, or you've lost your ability to walk, and you're in rehab trying to learn to walk again or move your hands and all of that. So would that follow the same pattern as when you were a child? So now did you go back to the learning where you are in space and learning that security and learning how to move before your brain can, I don't know, repair itself?
So the question, maybe just to repeat the question, sorry, for the people online, the question was, if you've had a stroke and you are in rehab learning to move and talk again, does the pattern of rehabilitation follow that of, development of a child?
Right. And the truth is maybe. Okay, and the reason being it's where the stroke happened, what damage to the brain happened because of the stroke, how severe was the damage. Because a lot of rehabilitation post-stroke is a matter of this neuroplasticity deal, right? And so I use an example as if we all held hands and we wanted to close that door over there. And this is how we close the door. I reached over, I touched your hand, you reached over and touched the next person's hand, on. And that was a terribly inefficient way to close the door, but that's how we did it. With a stroke, we might remove half of those people from that equation, right? But as long as you're within reach, I might be able to get to you to trigger that chain of events, right? I have to work a little bit harder, okay? And so that takes more energy than it once did to do it. But over time, that becomes, what do we need those other 50% of people for? Because now we just do it. Does that answer that a little bit?
Okay, we maybe have time for one more question. Do we have one more question? Yes.
Okay. So you talked about the inner ear,
Mm-hmm.
and I have Meniere's.
Okay.
Does that have a significant?
So the question was, with Meniere's disease, how does that affect the brain?
Well, the wonderful thing is our brain compensates a lot, okay? And so does Meniere's disease mean you're going to have problems further? Is that what you're asking? Or
Yeah, just not how it affects that, because you mentioned inner ear to look for the three things.
yeah, so one of the great parts is it is three things, right? And so when we have damage to a particular organ, like Meniere's disease is a damage to the inner ear, our eyes and our muscles and joints pick up a lot of the slack. So at points where early on in that you're probably dizzy, that type of deal, and that slowed down. Okay, as your brain compensated for those things, as your eyes became more dominant, and as your muscles and joints started to do that. Plus, there's some diet restrictions and things that with Meniere's to do that. Does that answer your question? I hope. If not, tell me again.
Just kind of maybe to close this out, and I think Dr. Hubbard will stick around if anybody has any other questions. But I think that speaks to the hope, I think, for all of us, is that our brain is plastic, that no matter how old we are, no matter how far debilitated we feel, there is always room for improvement. And our brain is the functionality of our brain is unbelievable. If anybody's familiar with artificial intelligence systems, computers, it's computers that are just taking in information, and the more information they get, the more connections they make, the more they can do. And that's it's based off of how our brain functions, is that the more information our brain takes in, the more it connects, the more it can do. And so, one piece of advice, is that if there's ever something that's difficult for you, if there's a movement that's difficult, if there's a yoga pose that's difficult, if there's an activity, a crossword puzzle, if you don't like crossword puzzles, there's probably a reason why your brain functionally, is not strong at that. So those are the things you need to do, and so kind of changing your lifestyle, your brain will adapt. I mean, there are studies where they've taken goggles and they've put people in goggles that flips the world upside down, and for the first 10 minutes, they're falling over and they're dizzy, but your brain within a very short period of time will adapt to that. And so that's the amazing thing, about the brain. And, here at the Reardon Clinic, we talk about a lot of the nutrients the brain needs, and, you need the nutrients and oxygen and, everything to make sure that those neurons are as healthy as they can be. But when that isn't enough, then functionally the brain needs movement and it needs stimulation. And that is what Dr. Hubbard does, is very, very specific movements to target areas of weakness in the brain. And it's pretty amazing the difference it can make. So So thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thanks for having me. It's a good time.
And then if anybody's filled out a survey, we're going to go around and collect those, and then we have a drawing.